Abandoned goat finds shelter with a lonely old woman. Their story will move you. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The morning sunlight crept over the hills, casting long shadows across the quiet farm. Edith sat on the porch in her wooden rocking chair, the rhythmic creak breaking the silence of the early hours. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers curled loosely around a faded photograph. She had looked at it 1,000 times before. A picture of her younger self, standing beside her late husband, Robert, and their daughter, Mary. The three of them were smiling, their faces bright with the hope of a future that had since faded into memory. Now the farm felt empty. The fields that had once been alive with crops were overgrown. The barn stood mostly unused, and the sound of laughter that had once echoed through the house was long gone. Edith's daughter had moved to the city years ago, and Robert had passed away not long after. At 83, Edith was left with little more than her memories and the quiet hum of the countryside to keep her company. She sighed, setting the photograph on the small table beside her. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of dew-covered grass. Edith took a deep breath and closed her eyes, trying to savor the peace of the moment. But the peace only highlighted the loneliness she had grown accustomed to. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a faint bleating that drifted through the still air. Edith's eyes snapped open, her brow furrowing as she leaned forward in her chair. She listened intently, the sound coming again, this time louder. It was unmistakable, the cry of a goat. Edith stood slowly, her joints protesting the movement as she made her way down the porch steps. Her boots crunched against the gravel path as she followed the sound, her heart beating faster with a mix of curiosity and concern. The bleating grew louder as she approached the edge of her property, where the overgrown fields met the dense woods. There, standing in the tall grass, was a goat. It was a small creature, its white coat speckled with patches of brown. Its horns were short, its body thin, and its eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. The goat bleated again as it spotted Edith, taking a cautious step back but too exhausted to run. "What in the world are you doing here?" Edith murmured, her voice soft and soothing. She crouched as best she could, her knees creaking in protest as she extended a hand. The goat flinched but didn't move away, its tiny legs trembling beneath its frail body. Edith's heart ached at the sight. The poor creature looked like it hadn't eaten in days, its ribs visible beneath its thin coat. She glanced around, searching for any sign of where it might have come from. But the road was empty, and there were no neighboring farms close enough for a goat to wander from. "Poor thing," she said gently. "You've been left behind, haven't you?" The goat let out another bleat, softer this time, as though it understood her words. Edith hesitated for a moment, then stood slowly, her hand brushing the dirt from her skirt. "Come on," she said, her voice firm but kind. "Let's get you some water." She turned and began walking back toward the house, glancing over her shoulder to see if the goat would follow. It hesitated for a moment, its ears flicking nervously, but then it took a tentative step forward, its small hooves crunching against the gravel. Edith smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth stirring in her chest as the goat trailed behind her. When they reached the porch, Edith fetched a bowl from the kitchen and filled it with cool water. She placed it on the ground, watching as the goat sniffed it cautiously before lapping it up with surprising vigor. "That's it," she said softly. "Take your time." As the goat drank, Edith studied it more closely. Its coat was dirty, its hooves chipped, and there was a small scratch on its flank. It was clear the animal had been through a rough time, and Edith couldn't help but wonder how it had ended up here, on her quiet farm in the middle of nowhere. She reached out cautiously, her hand brushing against the goat's side. The animal flinched but didn't pull away, its body tense beneath her touch. "You've had a rough go of it, haven't you?" Edith murmured. "Well, you're safe now." The words surprised even her. She hadn't planned to keep the goat. It wasn't as though she had the energy or resources to care for another living being. But something about the creature stirred a sense of responsibility in her, a flicker of the maternal instinct she thought she had lost long ago. Over the next few hours, Edith did her best to make the goat comfortable. She found an old blanket in the barn and laid it out in the corner, creating a makeshift bed. She rummaged through her pantry for anything the goat might eat, eventually settling on some apples and a handful of oats. The goat ate cautiously, its wide eyes watching her every move. As the day turned to evening, Edith sat on the porch once more, the goat lying a few feet away, its body curled into a tight ball. The quiet companionship was oddly comforting, a stark contrast to the loneliness that usually filled her evenings. For the first time in years, Edith felt a spark of something she couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just a sense of purpose. She glanced at the goat, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I suppose I'll need to come up with a name for you," she said. The goat didn't respond, its eyes half closed as it rested. Edith chuckled softly, the sound surprising her. It had been a long time since she had laughed. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Edith leaned back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. The goat's steady breathing filled the silence, a comforting reminder that, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't entirely alone. The next morning, Edith woke earlier than usual, her old bones creaking as she pushed herself out of bed. The faint sound of bleeding reached her ears, and she paused for a moment, remembering the events of the previous day. A small smile spread across her face as she shuffled to the window and peered outside. There, in the morning light, stood the goat, nibbling cautiously at the grass near the porch. Edith got dressed quickly, her movements steadier than usual as she made her way to the kitchen. She brewed a pot of coffee, the aroma filling the small farmhouse, and prepared a slice of toast. But as she sat at the table, her mind wandered to the goat. She had left it a makeshift bed in the barn, but it seemed the little creature had decided it preferred being closer to the house. With her coffee cup in hand, Edith stepped outside onto the porch. The goat looked up at her, its ears flicking as it let out a soft bleat. "Good morning," Edith said, her voice warm. "You're an early riser, aren't you?" The goat watched her closely as she descended the steps, its dark eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and caution. Edith walked slowly, her steps deliberate as she approached. She crouched down, ignoring the ache in her knees, and extended a hand. The goat sniffed her fingers before nudging her palm gently with its nose. "There we go," Edith murmured, her smile widening. "You're starting to trust me, aren't you?" She spent the next hour tending to the goat's needs. She found an old bucket and filled it with fresh water, placing it near the porch. She scoured her pantry for more food, eventually settling on another apple and some leftover bread. The goat ate eagerly, its small frame trembling slightly as it chewed. Edith watched it closely, her heart aching at the sight of its thin ribs and wary demeanor. "You need a name," she said softly, her fingers brushing against the goat's coat as it ate. "Can't keep calling you goat, can I?" She thought for a moment, her mind drifting to the books she used to read to her daughter when she was young. One story in particular came to mind, a tale about a mischievous goat named Clover who brought joy to everyone it met. Edith smiled, the memory warm and bittersweet. "Clover," she said aloud. The goat lifted its head, as if responding to the sound of its new name. Edith chuckled softly. "Clover it is, then." As the days passed, Clover began to settle into life on the farm. Edith set up a small pen near the barn, complete with fresh hay and a sturdy shelter made from an old wooden crate. Clover seemed content, spending her days grazing in the overgrown fields and exploring the edges of the property. But more often than not, Edith would find her near the porch, her presence a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. At first, Edith wasn't sure if she could handle the responsibility of caring for Clover. Her days were already filled with the small tasks required to keep the farm running, tending to the garden, maintaining the house, and managing her own health. But as time went on, she found that Clover's presence brought her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Each morning, Edith would step outside with a bucket of water and a handful of oats. Greeting Clover with a cheerful "good morning," the goat would bleat in response, her tail wagging as she trotted over to meet her. It became a routine, one that gave Edith a reason to get out of bed each day. But Clover wasn't just a passive presence on the farm. She had a way of making herself known, whether it was by knocking over a watering can in the garden or sneaking into the house when Edith left the door open. One afternoon, Edith returned from hanging laundry to find Clover standing in the kitchen, her nose buried in a bag of flour. "Clover!" Edith exclaimed, her hands on her hips. The goat froze, her face dusted with white powder as she turned to look at Edith. For a moment, they stared at each other, and then Edith burst out laughing, the sound echoing through the small farmhouse. "You're a troublemaker, you know that?" Edith said, her laughter subsiding as she ushered Clover back outside. But even as she cleaned up the mess, she couldn't stop smiling. Clover's antics, though occasionally frustrating, brought a sense of liveliness to the farm that had been missing for far too long. As Clover grew more comfortable, so did Edith. The quiet days no longer felt so heavy, and the evenings were filled with the soft sound of Clover's bleating as she settled into her pen. Edith found herself talking to the goat as though she were an old friend, sharing stories about her life and memories of her family. "You would have loved Robert," Edith said one evening as she sat on the porch, Clover lying at her feet. "He had a way with animals just like you. And Mary, she would have spoiled you rotten." Clover blinked up at her, her dark eyes calm and steady. Edith reached down, her fingers brushing against Clover's coat. "It's been a long time since I've had anyone to talk to," she said softly. "Thank you for keeping me company." The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Clover seemed to understand Edith in a way that went beyond words, her presence a constant source of comfort and companionship. Edith began to feel a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since Robert's passing, her days filled with the simple joy of caring for another living being. But it wasn't just Edith who noticed the change. Her neighbors, who had grown accustomed to the reclusive old woman on the hill, began to see her more often. Edith started venturing into town, her trips to the market no longer a chore, but an opportunity to share stories about Clover. "You should see her," Edith told the clerk at the general store one afternoon. "She's a little rascal, always getting into things. But she's got the sweetest temperament." The clerk smiled, handing Edith a bag of oats. "Sounds like she's good for you," he said. "It's nice to see you out and about again." Edith nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. Clover had done more than just bring life back to the farm. She had brought Edith back to life as well. One day, as Edith worked in the garden, she heard the sound of children's laughter. She looked up to see a group of kids from the neighboring farm standing at the edge of her property, their eyes wide as they watched Clover. The goat, ever the entertainer, was prancing around the yard, her tail wagging as she chased a butterfly. "Can we pet her?" one of the children called out, his voice filled with excitement. Edith hesitated for a moment, her old instincts telling her to keep to herself. But then she looked at Clover, who seemed to be enjoying the attention, and she smiled. "Of course," she said, waving them over. "Her name's Clover." The children approached cautiously, their laughter ringing out as Clover nuzzled their hands. Edith watched from the porch, her heart light as she saw the joy on their faces. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a reminder that life was meant to be shared. That evening, as the sun set over the hills, Edith sat on the porch with Clover by her side. The goat's coat gleamed in the golden light, her dark eyes calm and steady as she rested her head on Edith's lap. Edith stroked her gently, her thoughts drifting to the future. "I don't know how you ended up here," she said softly, "but I'm glad you did." As the stars began to dot the night sky, Edith leaned back in her chair, a sense of peace settling over her. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face it. With Clover by her side, she knew she could handle whatever came next. As the days turned into weeks, Edith and Clover developed a bond that grew stronger with every passing moment. The routine they had fallen into brought a sense of structure and joy to Edith's days that had long been absent. Mornings were spent tending to Clover's needs, ensuring she had fresh water, hay, and the occasional treat, while afternoons became a time for exploration around the farm. Clover had a knack for making even the simplest activities feel extraordinary. She loved to follow Edith around the property, her small hooves clicking against the ground as she investigated every corner. Whether it was a patch of overgrown weeds, a forgotten garden tool, or the rustling sound of a squirrel darting through the trees, Clover greeted it all with endless curiosity. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Edith often found herself laughing at the goat's antics. One particularly sunny afternoon, Edith decided to tackle the neglected flower beds that bordered the farmhouse. Armed with a pair of gardening gloves and a trowel, she knelt on the ground, pulling weeds and loosening the soil. Clover, of course, was right beside her, occasionally nosing at the pile of weeds or pawing at the dirt as if trying to help. "You're not much of a gardener, are you?" Edith teased, glancing at Clover. The goat tilted her head, her ears flicking as if in response. Edith chuckled, shaking her head. "Still, it's nice to have some company." As they worked, Edith found herself talking aloud, her words flowing as naturally as if she were speaking to an old friend. She spoke about her late husband, Robert, and how they had once planted flowers together in this very spot. She reminisced about her daughter, Mary, and the summers they had spent tending the garden as a family. The memories, once painful, now felt comforting, like a warm blanket on a cold night. Clover listened attentively, her dark eyes fixed on Edith as she spoke. There was something about the goat's quiet presence that made it easier for Edith to open up, to share the thoughts and feelings she had kept bottled up for so long. It was as though Clover understood her in a way no one else could. By the time the sun began to set, the flower beds were cleared, and Edith felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in years. She wiped her hands on her apron and sat back on her heels, admiring their work. Clover stood beside her, nibbling on a stray blade of grass, her tail wagging slightly. "You're quite the partner, Clover," Edith said, reaching out to scratch behind the goat's ears. "I don't know what I'd do without you." As the weeks turned into months, Clover's presence continued to transform Edith's life. The once quiet farm began to feel alive again, filled with the sounds of bleating, laughter, and the soft crunch of hooves on the ground. Edith found herself spending more time outdoors, rediscovering the beauty of the land she had called home for so many years. But Clover's impact wasn't limited to the farm. Word of the unlikely friendship between the old woman and her goat began to spread through the small town. Neighbors who had once kept their distance started stopping by, curious to meet Clover and hear Edith's story. One afternoon, Edith was surprised to see a young couple standing at the edge of her property, their hands clasped nervously as they looked toward the farmhouse. She set down the basket of laundry she had been carrying and approached them, Clover trotting behind her. "Hello there," Edith said, her tone warm but curious. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled shyly, glancing at Clover. "We heard about your goat," she said. "Everyone in town has been talking about her. She sounds special." Edith chuckled, glancing down at Clover, who was sniffing at the woman's shoes. "She is special," she said. "Her name's Clover." The man crouched down, holding out a hand to Clover, who nuzzled his fingers in greeting. "She's beautiful," he said. "It's amazing how animals can bring so much joy into our lives." Edith nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "She's brought me more joy than I ever could have imagined." The couple stayed for a while, chatting with Edith and marveling at Clover's friendly demeanor. Before they left, they invited Edith to a community event in town, a farmer's market that also featured local crafts and a petting zoo. "You should bring Clover," the woman said. "I think people would love to meet her." Edith hesitated. She hadn't been to a community event in years, not since Robert's passing. The thought of venturing back into the world felt daunting, but the idea of sharing Clover's story with others was tempting. "I'll think about it," Edith said finally, and the couple left with a wave. That evening, as Edith sat on the porch with Clover by her side, she mulled over the invitation. The idea of stepping out of her comfort zone was intimidating, but she couldn't ignore the excitement bubbling in her chest at the thought of introducing Clover to the world. She looked down at the goat, who was dozing peacefully, her small body curled against Edith's leg. "What do you think, Clover?" Edith asked softly. "Should we go?" Clover let out a sleepy bleat, her ears flicking in response. Edith smiled, her decision made. The following weekend, Edith loaded Clover into the back of her old truck, securing her in a makeshift pen lined with hay. The drive to town was short but nerve-wracking, Edith's hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she navigated the narrow roads. Clover seemed unfazed, her calm demeanor a reassuring presence. When they arrived at the market, Edith was overwhelmed by the bustling crowd and the lively atmosphere. Stalls lined the square, offering everything from fresh produce to handmade crafts. Children darted between the booths, their laughter ringing out as they explored. Edith took a deep breath, her nerves easing as she saw the smiles on people's faces. She led Clover to the petting zoo area, where a small pen had been set up for her. As soon as the goat was inside, children and adults alike began to gather, their excitement palpable. Clover, ever the social butterfly, greeted them with gentle nudges and curious sniffs, her tail wagging as she soaked up the attention. Edith watched from a distance at first, her heart swelling with pride as she saw how much joy Clover brought to everyone around her. People asked about the goat story, and Edith found herself sharing how Clover had come into her life, her words flowing easily as she recounted their journey. By the end of the day, Edith was exhausted but happy. Clover had been a hit, and Edith had reconnected with people she hadn't spoken to in years. She realized that Clover had done more than just bring life back to the farm. She had brought Edith back to the community, reminding her of the importance of connection and shared experiences. As they drove home that evening, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the fields, Edith glanced at Clover in the rearview mirror. The goat was lying contentedly in the pen, her eyes half closed as she rested. Edith smiled, her heart full. "You've changed everything, Clover," she said softly, "and I'll never be able to thank you enough." That night, as Edith sat on the porch with Clover at her feet, she reflected on how much her life had changed since the goat had wandered onto her property. She had found not only a companion but also a renewed sense of purpose and a reason to keep moving forward. The stars twinkled above, their light casting a gentle glow over the farm. Edith reached down, her hand resting on Clover's back as she whispered, "You saved me. You know that? You brought me back to life." Clover let out a soft bleat, her eyes closing as she leaned into Edith's touch. Together, they sat in peaceful silence, the bond between them stronger than ever. The following days felt like a dream for Edith. The trip to the farmer's market had sparked something within her, a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt in years. For so long, her days had been marked by quiet solitude, with the occasional visitor serving as a fleeting interruption. But now, things were different. Clover had opened a door to the world she had once been part of, and Edith found herself eager to step through it. The morning after the market, Edith woke early, the sunlight streaming through her window. She made her way to the kitchen, her movements steady as she prepared a pot of coffee. Outside, she could hear Clover's soft bleating, a sound that had become as comforting as the ticking of the old clock on the wall. She smiled, glancing out the window to see the goat grazing contentedly near the porch. After breakfast, Edith stepped outside with a bucket of water and a handful of oats. Clover trotted over to meet her, her tail wagging like a happy dog. Edith chuckled, setting the bucket down and scratching behind Clover's ears. "Good morning, Clover," she said. "Did you sleep well?" Clover let out a cheerful bleat in response, nuzzling Edith's hand. Edith watched her for a moment, marveling at how much the goat had changed since the day she found her. Clover's coat was now sleek and shiny, her frame sturdy and strong. The timid, frail creature that had wandered onto the farm was gone, replaced by a confident, spirited companion. Edith spent the rest of the morning tending to the garden, her hands moving deftly as she planted rows of flowers and vegetables. Clover was never far away, her curiosity leading her to inspect each task Edith undertook. When Edith paused to wipe the sweat from her brow, Clover would nudge her gently, as if reminding her to take a break. "You're quite the little helper," Edith said with a laugh, reaching out to pat Clover's side. "I don't know how I managed before you came along." By midday, the sun was high in the sky, and Edith decided it was time for a break. She and Clover retreated to the shade of the porch, where Edith settled into her rocking chair with a glass of iced tea. Clover lay at her feet, her head resting on Edith's shoe as she dozed. As she rocked gently, Edith's mind wandered to the farmer's market. The memory of the smiling faces and kind words from strangers filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, she felt connected to something larger than herself. She thought about the couple who had invited her to the market, about the children who had laughed as they petted Clover, and about the neighbors who had stopped to chat and share their own stories. It was a reminder that even in her small, quiet town, there was a world of connection and community waiting to be embraced. That afternoon, Edith received an unexpected visitor. As she was hanging laundry on the line, a car pulled up the gravel driveway. Edith turned to see a young woman stepping out, her arms full of flowers and a small basket. The woman approached with a warm smile, her footsteps hesitant but eager. "Hello," the woman said, her voice cheerful. "You must be Edith. My name's Sarah. I live a few streets over, and I heard about your goat at the market." Edith smiled, setting down the sheet she had been hanging. "Hello, Sarah. It's nice to meet you. And yes, that's Clover over there," she said, gesturing toward the goat, who was lounging in the shade of the porch. Sarah's eyes lit up as she spotted Clover. "She's beautiful," she said. "I brought these for you." She held out the flowers and basket, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Just a little something to say thank you. Your story at the market really inspired me." Edith was taken aback, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the gifts. "Thank you, Sarah," she said softly. "That's very kind of you." The two women chatted for a while, standing in the dappled sunlight as Clover ambled over to investigate. Sarah shared stories about her own pets, and Edith found herself opening up about her life on the farm, about Robert, and about how Clover had changed everything. By the time Sarah left, Edith felt lighter, her heart buoyed by the connection. She placed the flowers in a vase on the kitchen table, their vibrant colors brightening the room. The basket contained fresh produce and a jar of homemade jam, and Edith couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. As the days passed, more neighbors stopped by to visit. Some brought gifts, while others simply came to meet Clover and hear Edith's story. Each visit left Edith feeling more connected to her community, her once isolated farm now a hub of laughter and warmth. One evening, as Edith sat on the porch watching the sunset, she thought about how much her life had changed in such a short time. Clover had done more than just bring joy to her days. She had reminded her of the importance of connection, of sharing her life with others. "You've brought so much more than I ever expected," Edith said, her voice soft as she looked down at Clover. The goat was lying at her feet, her eyes half closed as she dozed. "You've given me a reason to believe in the goodness of life again." The next morning, Edith woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. The sky was overcast, the gray clouds casting a somber light over the farm. She dressed quickly, her thoughts turning to Clover. The goat hated being cooped up in the barn, but Edith knew it wasn't safe for her to roam in the rain. As she stepped outside, the rain soaking through her boots, Edith made her way to the barn. Clover was standing near the door, her ears flicking as she watched Edith approach. "Good morning, Clover," Edith said, her voice warm despite the chill in the air. "Looks like we'll be staying inside today." She spent the morning in the barn, brushing Clover's coat and tidying the pen. The rain continued to fall, the steady rhythm creating a soothing backdrop to their time together. Edith found herself talking to Clover, sharing stories about her life, her hopes, and her dreams. It was as though the goat could understand her, her dark eyes filled with quiet wisdom. As the day wore on, the rain began to let up, and Edith decided to let Clover out for a bit of fresh air. She led the goat to the edge of the porch, where they stood together, watching the clouds part to reveal patches of blue sky. The farm looked fresh and renewed, the rain washing away the dust and leaving everything glistening with life. Edith took a deep breath, the scent of wet earth filling her lungs. She glanced down at Clover, who was sniffing the air, her tail wagging slightly. "You've brought me back to life, Clover," Edith said softly, "and I'll never stop being grateful for you." Clover let out a soft bleat, nuzzling Edith's hand as if to say she felt the same. Together, They stood in the quiet of the moment, their bond unspoken but deeply felt. The rain-soaked earth brought a fresh vitality to the farm, and Edith decided to spend the following morning tending to the areas that had been neglected over the years. She armed herself with her trusty gardening tools and stepped out into the yard, Clover following close behind. The goat's curiosity knew no bounds, and Edith found it hard to stay focused on her work with Clover's constant antics. As Edith knelt down to pull weeds from a flower bed, Clover took an intense interest in the trowel. She nudged it with her nose, then attempted to lift it with her mouth, her small horns bobbing in determination. Edith couldn't help but laugh, brushing the dirt from her hands as she reached over to pat Clover's head. "You're more mischief than help," she teased. "But I don't mind. I like the company." Clover bleated in response, her tail wagging as if she understood. Edith resumed her work, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Having Clover by her side made even the most mundane tasks feel meaningful, as though she were building something for both of them. A home, a life, a second chance. By mid-afternoon, Edith decided to take a break. She filled a bucket with water for Clover and poured herself a glass of iced tea before settling into her rocking chair on the porch. Clover lay down at her feet, her chin resting on Edith's shoe as she dozed in the warm sunlight. The quiet moment gave Edith time to reflect on everything that had changed since Clover had wandered into her life. The loneliness that had once consumed her felt like a distant memory, replaced by a deep sense of purpose and connection. Clover wasn't just a companion. She was a lifeline, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always a chance for renewal. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Edith prepared for bed with a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in years. But just as she was about to turn off the lights, she heard a commotion outside. A loud crash followed by Clover's frantic bleating. Her heart leapt into her throat as she grabbed her robe and rushed to the door. The scene that greeted her was one of chaos. A large branch had fallen from the old oak tree near the barn, its weight crushing part of the fence that surrounded Clover's pen. The goat was pacing nervously, her cries filled with fear as she tried to keep her distance from the debris. "Clover," Edith called, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her. She hurried to the pen, her hands trembling as she assessed the damage. The fence was badly broken, leaving a gap wide enough for Clover to escape. Edith knew she had to act quickly to prevent the goat from wandering off into the night. "Easy, girl," she said softly, approaching Clover with cautious steps. The goat's wide eyes met hers, and Edith could see the fear there. She reached out a hand, her voice calm and soothing. "It's okay, Clover. I've got you." It took several minutes of coaxing, but Clover eventually calmed down enough for Edith to lead her into the barn. Once the goat was safely inside, Edith closed the doors and leaned against them, her heart pounding. The adrenaline from the moment began to fade, replaced by a deep sense of relief. Edith spent the next hour securing the barn and cleaning up the fallen branch as best she could in the dim light. By the time she returned to the house, she was exhausted, her body aching from the effort. But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't help but feel grateful. Clover was safe, and that was all that mattered. The following morning, Edith wasted no time repairing the fence. She enlisted the help of her neighbor, a kind man named George who had offered his assistance on more than one occasion. Together, they worked to rebuild the damaged section, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. "You've got quite the bond with that goat," George remarked as he hammered a nail into place. "Not everyone would go through this much trouble." Edith smiled, wiping the sweat from her brow. "She's worth it," she said simply. "She's changed my life more than I ever thought possible." George nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Funny how animals have a way of doing that," he said. "They see us for who we are, no judgment, no expectations. Just love." Edith's chest tightened at his words, the truth of them resonating deeply. Clover had seen her at her lowest, had been there when she felt invisible and forgotten. And in return, Edith had given her everything she had to offer: her care, her love, her heart. By the time the fence was repaired, the sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the farm. Clover trotted over to inspect their work, her tail wagging as she sniffed the newly built section. Edith chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind the goat's ears. "Looks good, doesn't it?" she said. Clover bleated in agreement, her eyes bright and full of trust. The bond between them only grew stronger in the weeks that followed. Clover became a fixture in Edith's daily life, her presence bringing joy and laughter to the farm. Neighbors continued to stop by, their visits turning into shared meals and long conversations on the porch. The farm, once a place of solitude, had become a gathering spot, a hub of warmth and connection. But it wasn't just the farm that had changed. It was Edith herself. She felt stronger, more alive, as though a part of her that had been dormant for years had finally awakened. She found herself smiling more often, her laughter coming easily. And in the quiet moments, when it was just her and Clover, she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in a long time. One crisp autumn morning, Edith decided to take Clover for a walk through the woods that bordered the property. She had avoided the area for years, the memories of family hikes with Robert and Mary too painful to revisit. But with Clover by her side, she felt ready to face them. The woods were alive with color, the leaves a vibrant mix of red, orange, and gold. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Clover trotted ahead, her small hooves crunching against the forest floor as she explored. Edith followed, her steps steady as she took in the familiar sights and sounds. She remembered how Robert used to point out the different types of trees, how Mary would collect acorns and pine cones to bring home. The memories were bittersweet, but they no longer felt like a weight she couldn't bear. As they reached a clearing, Edith paused, her breath catching in her throat. The spot was one she hadn't visited in years, a small meadow where she and her family had often stopped for picnics. The sight of it brought a rush of emotions, but instead of sadness, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She sat down on a fallen log, her hands resting on her lap as she watched Clover graze nearby. The goat's presence was a reminder of everything Edith had gained, of the life she had built despite the losses she had endured. "You've brought me back here, Clover," Edith said softly. "To the memories, to the life I thought I'd left behind." "Thank you." Clover lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting Edith's. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the bond between them unspoken but deeply felt. And in that moment, Edith knew that she wasn't alone, that she never truly had been. As they made their way back to the farm, the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the landscape. Edith felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet assurance that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Clover trotted ahead, her tail wagging as she led the way. And as Edith followed, her heart full and her steps steady, she knew that their journey was far from over. As autumn deepened, the days grew shorter, and the crispness of the air hinted at the approach of winter. Edith and Clover had settled into a rhythm that made the changing seasons feel like a natural backdrop to their evolving bond. The mornings were filled with chores, and the afternoons were reserved for quiet companionship on the porch or walks through the fields. Edith found herself looking forward to each day, her life now imbued with a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years. One chilly morning, Edith awoke to the sound of wind howling against the house. The first frost had come overnight, painting the windows with delicate patterns of ice. She pulled on her thick cardigan and sturdy boots before heading outside to check on Clover. The goat's pen was sturdy and warm, but Edith still worried about her companion, especially with the colder weather settling in. As she opened the barn door, Clover trotted over to greet her, her breath visible in the chilly air. Edith smiled, reaching down to scratch behind the goat's ears. "Good morning, Clover," she said. "Winter's on its way, isn't it?" Clover bleated softly, nuzzling Edith's hand. Edith had made sure to insulate the barn with extra straw and blankets, creating a cozy space for Clover to retreat to when the weather turned harsh. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Clover preferred being closer to the house. Edith decided then and there to build a small shelter for Clover near the porch, a place where the goat could stay warm and still be close by. The project became a labor of love over the next few days. Edith enlisted the help of her neighbor George, who brought over spare wood and tools to construct the shelter. Together, They worked in the crisp autumn air, George handling the heavy lifting while Edith took charge of painting and adding small touches to make it feel welcoming. By the end of the week, the shelter was complete. It stood just a few feet from the porch, its roof slanted to keep the rain and snow out, and its interior lined with fresh hay. Edith added a small wooden sign above the entrance that read, "Clover's Corner," painted in a cheerful shade of blue. When Clover saw her new home, she pranced around it excitedly, her tail wagging as she explored every inch. Edith laughed, watching as the goat settled in, her eyes bright with curiosity. "You like it, don't you?" Edith said, leaning against the porch railing. "It's all yours, Clover." The shelter quickly became Clover's favorite spot. She would spend hours lounging inside, her head poking out to watch Edith work in the garden or wave to neighbors as they passed by. On particularly cold evenings, Edith would bring Clover a warm blanket, tucking it around her like she would a child. The sight of the goat snuggled up in her little corner never failed to bring a smile to Edith's face. As winter approached, Edith found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed in the months since Clover had arrived. The loneliness that had once weighed so heavily on her heart was gone, replaced by a sense of fulfillment and connection. Clover had not only brought joy to her days, but had also rekindled her relationships with the people around her. One snowy afternoon, Edith received a surprise visitor. Sarah, the young woman who had first stopped by after the farmer's market, arrived with a box of holiday decorations and a bright smile on her face. "I thought Clover might like to help decorate for Christmas," Sarah said, holding up a strand of twinkling lights. Edith laughed, her eyes twinkling. "I think she'd love that," she said. "And so would I." Together, they set to work transforming the farm into a winter wonderland. Sarah helped Edith hang lights along the porch, their warm glow reflecting off the freshly fallen snow. They draped garlands over the barn doors and placed a small wreath on Clover's shelter, the goat watching with interest as they worked. When they were finished, the farm looked magical, its festive decorations standing out against the snowy landscape. Clover seemed particularly fascinated by the lights, her nose twitching as she inspected the garlands. Edith couldn't help but laugh as the goat tried to nibble on a strand of tinsel. "You're going to be the star of the holidays, Clover," Edith said, scratching behind the goat's ears. "Just you wait." The holiday season brought a flurry of activity to the farm. Neighbors stopped by with gifts and treats, and Edith found herself hosting small gatherings on the porch, the warmth of the lights and Clover's cheerful presence drawing people in. For the first time in years, the farm felt alive with laughter and joy. On Christmas Eve, Edith sat by the fire, a cup of tea warming her hands as she gazed out the window. The snow was falling softly, blanketing the farm in a serene stillness. Clover was curled up in her shelter, the glow of the lights casting a gentle glow around her. Edith's heart swelled with gratitude as she thought about everything Clover had brought into her life. The goat had given her more than just companionship. She had given her a reason to hope, to dream, and to believe in the beauty of life again. As the clock struck midnight, Edith stepped outside, the cold air biting at her cheeks. She walked over to Clover's shelter and knelt down beside her, her hands brushing against the goat's soft coat. "Merry Christmas, Clover," she whispered. "Thank you for everything." Clover let out a soft bleat, nuzzling Edith's hand as though to say the feeling was mutual. Together, they sat in the quiet of the night, the bond between them unspoken but deeply felt. The winter months passed in a blur of snow and warmth, the days growing longer as spring approached. By the time the first buds began to bloom, Edith felt like a new woman. Her life was full of purpose and joy, and the farm had become a place of connection and love once more. One sunny morning, as Edith and Clover sat on the porch, a group of children from the neighboring farms came running up the driveway, their laughter ringing out like music. They had come to visit Clover, their favorite goat, and Edith welcomed them with open arms. Watching the children play with Clover, Edith felt a deep sense of peace. The farm was no longer a place of solitude. It was a home, a haven, a reminder of everything she held dear. And at the heart of it all was Clover, the goat who had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined. As the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Edith sat on the porch with Clover at her side. The goat's head rested on her lap, her eyes half closed as she dozed. Edith stroked her gently, her heart full. "You saved me, Clover," she said softly. "You brought me back to life, and I'll never stop being grateful for you." The stars began to twinkle above, their light casting a gentle glow over the farm. Edith leaned back in her chair, the weight of her years feeling lighter than ever. With Clover by her side, she knew she had found more than a companion. She had found a reason to keep going, to keep dreaming, and to keep loving. And in that moment, as the world around them fell into a peaceful hush, Edith knew that she and Clover were exactly where they were meant to be.